Chapter 2 Priya. Every root and every inch of green in Ahiranya's soil sang to her. She heard the song all the time, sleeping, waking, felt its weight as if she were the limb of a much larger beast, a giant thing slumbering in Ahiranya's trees, its earth. She closed her eyes, the sun touching warm fingertips against her face through the thick canopies of the trees. Slivers of cool shadow broke the heat into fragments. She didn't need to open her eyes to find her way. The song guided her. The soil yielded to her footsteps, rippling like water. "This way," it hummed. "This is where you will find what you're searching for." "If you don't look where you're going to walk straight into a tree," said Sima. Priya opened her eyes and turned to give Sima a glare. "I won't," she said. "I would never." "Oh, maybe not, but it'd be very funny if you did," Sima replied. "Aren't you meant to be exuding holiness and authority? It'll be very hard to do that if you felled by a branch." "Sima!" Sima grinned at her. "It might be best to keep your eyes open just in case." Priya was, in fact, meant to be maintaining a certain image. Even though she'd known today would be a messy work, she had dressed in the plain whites of the temple elder. For particularity, she had donned a salwar kameez rather than the traditional long tunic. But the loose cloth was bleached white as bone, and her hair was bound back in a high braided knot with beads of sacred wood darted through the length, here and there, in the same style the temple elders had once worn. It was Kritika, of all people, who had encouraged her to take up the style. Soon after, pilgrims began to arrive in the waves at the Hirana's base, pleading for guidance from their new elders. Kritika had taken Priya aside and advised her to dress as the elders had once dressed. "There will be worshippers who remember the elders as I do," she said. "And for the rest, you must serve as a symbol, Elder Priya, and you must guide them." Priya was uneasy with the idea of being a symbol. She was uneasy with Kritika too, and with all the ex-rebels who had once served her brother. But she'd chosen this path, chosen the rebels who now called themselves mask keepers and the title of elder. She was far too stubborn to do anything but embrace this life with her arms flung wide. And if the right clothes made worshippers weep tears of reverence and feel hope again, and trust that Priya and Bhumika would rule them wisely, well then, Priya would wear white, and she would do her very best to act like the person she was meant to be. Priya offered Sima only the subtlest and most ladylike of extensive collection of rude gestures she knew, which made Sima laugh under her breath, then straightened up and squared her shoulders and kept her eyes open as she strode forward with what she hoped was a confident kind of grace. Around Priya and Sima, the other figures walked between the trees, a few once-born ex-rebels, with traces of magic coiling through their blood and scythes in their hands, a handful of soldiers carrying sabers, and 6 of the men and women who had once been servants in the regent's mahal, but now served the 2 temple elders in Ahiranya in a different capacity. For months, they had been training with Jivan in the mahal's practice yard, heaving around maces and beating fake soldiers made of wood and straw with hand sickles. Sima had even been given some training in archery, and she carried a bow and a quiver of arrows with her now. She only looked mildly nervous, but some of the other servants were nearly gray with fear. That was understandable. They were hunting imperial soldiers, after all. Gannam, one of the ex-rebels, made his way toward her. He wore the same mask he'd worn when he had been a fighter against Parijat Vipanru, a wooden oval large enough to conceal his entire face, the crude holes for eyes and a hollow for the mouth. She shouldn't have been able to see the questioning look he was giving her, but she could read the tilt in his head well enough. Priya shook her head. Not here. Not yet. Then she turned her attention back to the soil. She felt through it, felt the imperial soldiers ahead of her. Some were already impaled on stakes of thorn. Bhumika had set up that trap. She had a gift for things grown slow and strange. And Priya, well, she had a useful wellspring of anger. "Now," she said, and they crossed the last wall of trees and found the soldiers before them. The fight was quick and bloody. Priya tried to use her magic to subdue most of them, but one man, disarmed of his sword, wormed his way beyond her vines and tried to grapple her. She had the pleasure of punching him in the face. He went for the knife at his belt, tried to gut her. "This is why," she thought, blood simmering, her pulse pounding in her ears. "This is why you're killing them, breaking them. This." The soil pulled his feet deeper, deeper. His hands were still free. That was no matter. Priya could still attack him with her vines, still see him suffocated, dragged under. There was a whistle and a thud. An arrow had gone through his throat. She looked behind her and saw Sima, grey-faced, clutching her bow. Messy, Ghanem remarked. But the job's done. He straightened, squaring his shoulders. Elder Priya, he said. What now? They went home. Priya drew a dark shawl around her shoulders to conceal her attire, then dived into the city's depths with her companions surrounding her. Invisible in a crowd of soldiers and masked keepers, she was free to take in the sights around her without having to worry that she would be recognized and bowed to, worshipped or feared in a way that made her teeth itch with discomfort. The streets were busy around them, noisy and heaving with people. There were food stalls here and there, a group of children playing, and people squatting in the shade, watching the crowds drift by. Under the blue sky, the city was all churned mud and brightly painted stalls and shops. Empty lanterns hung from verandas, wavering in the mild wind. At night those lanterns would be filled with candles, and the city would glow like a constellation. For months, Hiranaprastha had been a shadow of itself, broken by both violence and fire. But the buildings had slowly been fixed or simply put back to use by necessity since then. Priya caught a glimpse of a house with a particularly broken wall as they moved through the streets. Someone had strung a curtain of wooden beads and colored glass across the gap. Sunlight through the glass shone green, blue, pink. Priya turned towards Sima, brushed the shoulders together to catch Sima's attention. In return, Sima offered her a tentative smile. Her face still had an ashy pallor, but she was starting to look more like herself now that they were nearing the mahal. How are you feeling now? Priya asked. Oh, just fine, Sima said. It was such a blatant lie that Priya almost laughed. She didn't, though. She didn't want to hurt Sima's feelings. She wanted to comfort her. It's all right if you feel conflicted, Priya said, about killing someone, or if you're still a little afraid. It was frightening. Sima looked down at her own hand and laughed awkwardly. I think maybe I was a little afraid, she admitted, and I was trying so hard to be brave, too. Priya knocked her shoulder against Sima's again, as close as she could get to a hug without embracing her in front of their companions. You did really well, she said. Trust me. Does it ever get easier, the fear? Sima asked. Do you start going into fights and just find a way to ignore all of it? You know? She waved a hand around vaguely. Or does being powerful the way you are stop you from being afraid? Priya didn't know how to explain that her relationship with fear had been complicated long before she became thrice-born. It helps, Priya admitted. But you've got nothing to be afraid of, Sima. You've got me. Ahead of them, Ghanem was using his bow to cut a swath through the crowd, carving their group a path back toward the mahal. Priya could see in the distance, looming above the low buildings of Hiranaprastha. Only the Hirana stood taller than it, an ancient mountain with the temple proper at its zenith. People took little notice of them as they walked, though few gave them nods of respect. In Hiranaprastha, the patrols that worked for the temple elders had become just as unremarkable a sight as the regent's soldiers had once been, simply part of the fabric of city life with all its rhythms and routines and dangers. I don't always want to hide behind you, Pri, Sima said ruefully. Maybe I want to be able to look after you too. Have you considered that? Sima, you literally shot a man through the throat for me, Priya said. Do you have any idea how impressive that is? I don't mean that you're weak or anything like that. I just mean... I know what you mean, said Sima. We protect each other. I know, Sima said again, her smile softening into something more real. There was almost color in her cheeks again. I really am getting better with a bow. Jivan's going to be so pleased. Absolutely, Priya agreed. He'll have you teaching the little ones before you know it. Sima gave a theatrical shudder. Don't threaten me with that, she said. They strode up the main entrance of the mahal. You did well, said Priya once they were inside. Took off her shawl and wiped what remained of the dried sweat and blood from the battle from her face and neck. Does anyone know who is on the next patrol? They'll want to check that no more Imperial soldiers are hiding somewhere. I'll ask Kritika who volunteered, Ghanem said. I told her I'd join her on the Hirana anyway. Then I'll talk to Jivan, Priya said. The mask keepers were Kiritika's people just as the ex-soldiers were Jivan's, and the balance of power was always interesting at best. Priya was desperately glad that Bhumika was so good at soothing the tensions between all the fragmented groups that made up Ahiranya's new ragtag government. She had no head for that kind of emotional, tiresome work. I'll talk to Jivan, said Sima. You need to go and wash and change. Aren't you meant to be receiving people on the Hirana this evening? You can't go like that. You'll scare people. Priya was meant to be on the Hirana later, it was true, welcoming worshippers and helping the rot riven, placing her hands on them and freezing the rot within them so it would progress no further, so they would live. And then tomorrow she would be out on patrol again. Thank you, Priya said. She gave Sima a grin and turned, intending to hurry back to her own room, where she could change. But instead, she found her feet leading her toward the orchard. Time to herself was so rare now, and though she didn't exactly have complaints, she couldn't resist the urge to take a moment alone. Just a moment when she could walk under trees and pluck a ripe fruit from the low-hanging branch, and purge the memory of imperial soldiers and imperial steel with the comfort of being alone in a familiar place. She had barely stepped into the orchard when she heard a voice calling her name. Priya! She looked up. Rook, she greeted him, squinting against the sunlight. He was seated on a high branch, leaning forward so he could see her, and waving one arm to catch her attention. What are you doing up there? Nothing, he said. Want me to throw you a fig? Yes, she said. He chucked one down and she caught it one-handed, bit straight into it. Between bites, she said, You're hiding, aren't you? Hiding is a strong word, Rook said. I said hello, didn't I? If I were hiding, I would have kept quiet. I know you're not hiding from me. You're meant to be in training. Do you want anything else? Rook asked helpfully. I can climb a different tree if you like. Any tree. Jivan is going to skin you. He would never, said Rook. He's too nice. He'll just make me run around the practice yard. Nice wasn't a word Priya would have applied to Jivan, who was solemn and harsh-faced and unsmiling, and seemed to spend all his time hovering around Bhumika or herding his trainees like cats. But she didn't argue. Gangnam's back. Rook's expression visibly brightened. Where is he? He's going to the Hirana. I'm going to go see him, Rook said decisively. Maybe he can train me later. Then Jivan won't be disappointed. Rook and Gangnam had been rebels together once. Rook had vowed to serve Bhumika and had been saved from death by Priya. That kind of bond stuck. But he and Gangnam had grown something special in their shared time in the Mahal, and Priya was glad of it. Often she found the two of them together, Gangnam patiently demonstrating the use of a sickle to Rook, who would copy him, frowning, all focus. Jivan will still be disappointed, but do what you like, Priya said with a sigh. Rook jumped down. He straightened up. Once he'd been so thin and so small, but even the short time he'd spent in the Hirana had added flesh to his bones and softened his face. He was stronger, taller, his curling hair thick enough now to almost conceal the fronds of leaves growing from his scalp. Do you want to come? She shook her head. I've had a busy morning. Are you going to see Elder Bhumika? Rook asked. I wasn't planning to, she said. Do you know how our little grandma is doing? Padma doesn't look like an old lady anymore, Rook said in his most disapproving voice. Well, mostly. She's not crying as much, I think. Khalida said Jivan got her a wooden bracelet to bite on to help her gums stop hurting. Sweet of him, said Priya. Then, is there a reason I should see Bhumika? Rook, who'd gained a disturbing interest in knowing absolutely everything, said, She's got a letter for you in her study, something from the Empress. A beat of silence. Priya swallowed, her heart racing. Finally, she said, I'm not even going to ask how you know that. I was helping Khalida look after Padma. We went to bring her to Lady Bhumika and I saw it then, he said anyway. Do you know what the letter's about? Go and find Ganam, you beast, Priya said. I won't tell Jivan I saw you unless he asks. She turned, walking sedately until Rook, who yelled his thanks with a laugh, had scampered off behind her. She didn't quite start running, but it was close enough. She read the official letter from the Empress to the elders of Ahiranya first. It was lying plainly on Bhumika's desk. Bhumika's study was barred to outsiders, but Priya, of course, had a key. Maybe Bhumika had known Priya would wander in at some point to rifle through the papers and decided to make Priya's life easier. She often made such small, thoughtful gestures. Sometimes Priya would return to her room and find sachets of herbs to perfume her clothes or a meal wrapped in cloth, and she knew it was Bhumika trying to take care of her, even as their responsibilities kept them so often apart, like two ghosts haunting the same space, never quite crossing paths. Next to the official missive, propped pointedly against a pile of books, lay a letter plainly addressed to Priya. It had no official seal of the Empress on it, no sign it was from Malini at all, but Priya knew. That Malini had gone one step further and written to her, had put down some of what bound them permanently in ink was, well, it made Priya feel soft and tender and stunned by Malini's foolishness. She opened the letter, pressed it flat. That writing, it had to be Malini's. It was too graceful to be anyone else's. She wrote of garlands, of Maniara and her river, and other tales of Yaksa and mortals. I didn't tell her these, Priya whispered, which meant that at some point Malini had read the birch bark mantras. Had she learned the tales for Priya's sake? Priya couldn't write back, she knew it. Whatever subtle means Malini had used to deliver this to her, and spirits, she hoped they had been subtle for Malini's sake. There was no way Priya should write to her in return. But somehow she found herself sitting at Bhumika's desk, grasping a clean sheet of paper, writing down words. "I miss you," she began.